For me, it's a whole lot easier to write something like the Dresden Files than it is to write the pure fantasy that the Codex Alera was. It was set in a whole other world. For Codex Alera, I mean, I was essentially I had to build a fantasy environment out of whole cloth. For the Dresden Files, I could say, and they met at Walmart. and probably everybody in the room knows what a Walmart looks like. I can say it was a baseball stadium, and we know what that looks like. It just saves me a lot of effort.
And what does that do to its staying power 40 years from now?
Oh, what does it do for staying power 40 years from now? Gotta be honest, don't care.
But in reference to how the genre is going forward, I mean, that's the reason I ask, because if the genre is going to travel forward and continue to grow, is a book going to be a standby, or is it going to be dated, like like Sargon the Sorcerer, some of the references you made, Mr. Fox?
Chronicles of Narnia.
As time goes, are they outdated, just not interesting?
Well, I don't think that's something that's endemic purely to urban fantasy. I think that's everything.
Absolutely.
I mean, and again, it's going to be, there's going to be people who come along after me and pick up the torch and say, okay, Jim had a great idea, but he really dropped the ball here, here, and here, and I'm going to do it right. I'm going to do it like this. And they're going to produce something that people go, wow, that's amazing. And while us old people go look back at it and go, oh, it's not anything like in my day. but the people are going to love just as much as we love whatever it is that we have a passion about now.
Well, I mean, in the realm of science fiction, anyone who writes near future science fiction has to realize that, after your near future date passes, basically your science fiction book has become alternate history. And so maybe, 40, 50 years from now, today's urban fantasy will be thought of as historical fiction with a twist.
Yeah, good point. Yes, aspiring writers in the room, note to self, for y'all, set it at least 100 years in the future. Actually, wait, you know what? With life expectancy going up the way it is, make it 150. Smart commercialism right there. Please.
If urban fantasy is taking the fantastic and bringing it into a normal modern setting, then wouldn't the reverse be something like what's called portal fantasy, like Alice in Wonderland, where you take somebody who's normal and shove them into a fantastic setting?
Which world? It's like a mirror image of the same thing.
Which world?
Although really, when you really get right down to it, that's a dirty trick writers have. Is whenever you're writing and you want to give somebody, you want to get the reader on your side. You try and make your character as much like the reader as you can in some way. Give them something to identify with, which is why so many of us boys and young men who watched Luke Skywalker going through his fantasy universe identified with him because we were upset at the man too. So when you take that, when you take the regular person and pitch them into the fantasy thing, I mean that's really, you're just using a slightly different color palette than if you're using a normal fantasy hero. Because one of the things that writers do, that many writers do, is try and get that. You as a writer, you want folks to identify with whoever it is who's your protagonist. You don't necessarily need them to like the guy, but you need them. You need a sense of understanding and a sense of a bond between the reader and the person that you're writing.
They've got to care about the character.
Yeah, you can love him, you can hate him, but either way, you need to create that sort of emotion.
You also need somebody to explain things too, because otherwise people already in the universe are already going to know. They're not going to talk about why we carry this hunk of plastic around. We have to explain it to somebody, and hence we explain it to the reader.
Yes, exactly. That's a concept that I learned. It was called the joy of idiocy. And the idea was, the writing teacher said, always keep an idiot around to ask questions. And they're like, why? And they're like, because that way when the idiot asks the question, then the reader gets the information as well. That's where Bob the Skull came from. When I wanted Harry to be the idiot. Bob would explain things to Harry so that the reader would get it, so I didn't have to dish out all the rules of magic yet, these big old block text sections.
Yeah, this gentleman right here.
From a world building standpoint, do you have to do more work to integrate fantasy with our well-known urban setting, or do you have to do more work to generate a fantasy world or a science fiction world from whole cloth?
Do you want to start with this one?
Yeah, sure. Well, I've set a lot of my work in New Orleans, which is, I mean, honestly, it's a comfort zone for me. I mean, I have, after living there for 22, 23 years, I kind of have a mental map of most of the neighborhoods laid out in my head. I mean, now that I've moved up here to Virginia, I mean, now I may have to occasionally go back to one of my New Orleans reference books or a Google map or something like that if I've forgotten a street name. But I mean, I can picture what Canal Street looks like. I know what the streetcars sound like. So, I mean, as I'm writing, you know, I can, it's much quicker for me to describe the sound of a streetcar and the sensation of sitting on a swaying streetcar and, you know, going through the Garden District late at night. Whereas if I was, you know, working in an entirely secondary world, I would have to just put in a lot more spade work and, you know, probably do, you know, for my New Orleans books, I basically don't write any notes on the setting to start out with. But if I'm inventing a world, I might have 30 or 40 pages of notes and probably have to draw maps and, you know, make myself lists of all the street names and everything, because otherwise you know, you screw yourself up.
Yeah, it's for me it's a balancing act, because on the one hand, if you're using an actual location, the information, especially, I mean, when I first started writing in, I think I wrote my first book in 1991. And when I first started writing then, there really wasn't a whole lot of internet to go look at. That wasn't until 95, 96 when you could actually start, you know, getting on the internet all over the place. And now it's like, okay, I need a rooftop in Chicago. Let me go to the Google Earth thing. I've got a three-dimensional map of Chicago right here. I can scan through and find this setting. Okay, here we go. We're going to do it right here. And I was actually able to, when I was in Chicago the next year, to drive by and say, there, that one right there, that's the street light that he shot out, so that no one would be able to see what happened right here. And you know, and that kind of makes it easy. On the other hand, if you mess something up, people are going to catch you. Which means that you have to do your homework, which gives you that extra level of you better know what you're talking about. Whereas if you're making up your whole world from whole cloth, you can make it look like exactly what you need it to be like. And while that is a lot of work to create it, that does offer you certain advantages as a writer, where, you know, I need this to happen in the story. Okay, I can shape my world to make this feasible to happen.
And no one can tell you you're wrong.
Yes, because it's make believe and I made it up, so it's mine.
Until you reuse it and forget something.
Yeah.
Does supernatural romance take that much work? I mean, that much detail time? Or is it more about reading penthouse letters and it's more pointed?
No, that's a fair question, and he's allowed to ask. Actually, it took me 2 years to create the sentence. So
It's that much. It's that much. It is the same amount of detail.
Yeah, I mean, there doesn't have to be, and not all romance writers do the same type of world building. You know, they might just change a couple things, and that's cool. You know, everything's the same except there's time travel, or everything's the same except there's vampires, or whatever. But you know, I would say that there's probably the same amount of world building on both sides of the romance aisle.
Sounds like there'd actually be more, because you have to make it interesting with the basic topic.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I would argue that urban fantasy is pretty interesting too. Yeah, so I would say, you know, same amount of world building,